Hi! We're in a different part of my apartment than we usually are for these videos. In this video, I am going to talk to you about the way that I think about writing a lit review. And my model for thinking about the lit review is the model of the tea party. Imagining that I am the hostess and I am inviting all of my sources to come and join me at the table. And as the hostess, it's my job to decide who gets to come, whom am I going to invite, and where they are going to sit at the table, and who they're going to have conversations with, right? So if you think about the model of actually inviting people to come and sit at the table with you, you put them near people that you think they might have an interesting conversation with, that they might enjoy talking to. And that is the same kind of thinking that we need to do when we are building a review of the literature. So a review of the literature can be a standalone piece of writing, and it can be quite long if it's a standalone piece of writing. It might go up to 10 or 20 pages if it's trying to be a comprehensive review of everything that experts have said about a particular field. But often, when we're writing a shorter paper, the literature review is just one section of our whole paper. Eventually, we want to advance our own argument, but before we can do that, we need to situate it within the conversation that's already happening. So the literature review in a longer paper is meant to be just kind of a snapshot of the conversation in the broader scholarly circle. So you kind of give an overview of the conversation you're getting into, and then you bring in your own ideas and contribute what you want to contribute to the conversation. So you can see I've got different kinds of things in front of me. I've got some books and I've got some photocopied articles here, and then I have a couple of sources that I never had time to print out. So they're being represented over here by my tablet and my phone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through the way that I have thought about these sources in conversation with each other. So I'm going to model for you this way of thinking of the author of the new piece of writing being in charge of the conversation that's happening, right? And the mental model that I use is that I'm having a tea party. So my first two sources are these guys. Jack Zipes, he's an eminent American fairy tale scholar, and Ruth Bodenheimer, she's also an eminent American fairy tale scholar. The problem with these two is that they're super old and that they write way too much. So I am kind of tired of listening to these two talk to each other in other people's writing. So they're really important. I need to include some of their ideas. I need to include their names, but I don't need to include everything they've ever said, and I don't want to let them dominate the conversation in my paper because I'm not interested in talking about what they're talking about. I'm interested in talking about some new things and pushing the conversation in new directions. So I'm going to seat these two next to each other because they really like to fight. And but I'm going to put them really far away from me. I'm going to put them way down there at the other end of the table. Sorry, I put them closest to you guys. All right. This author, Valerie Paradis, she comes back and she reinterprets some of what those other two said. So I'm going to seat her next to them because she kind of helps me move from the conversation that I don't want to have. She's kind of a bridge to the conversation that I do want to have. So I'm going to put her next to these guys that I don't want to talk to anymore, and leave them there for a while. This guy, Bruno Bettelheim, he's also pretty old and pretty eminent. His conversation is a little bit different. I'm not going to put him with those other old guys, but I'm going to seat him also at the end of the table, but on the other side, right? So my first two old people that I don't really want to talk to over here. another old person I don't really want to talk to over here. This guy, Vladimir Prop, he is a Russian folklorist. He's even older. He's probably the oldest source represented here on this table, but I really like this guy. So he helps to shape a lot of my thinking, right? A lot of what I do comes from the stuff that Prop has done. So I'm going to put him right up here next to me. He gets to stay nice and close. I want to make sure that everybody who comes to the party is talking to me and also talking to this guy. All right, so now we come down to the places where I want the conversation to be different. So all these people that I put really far away from me, one thing that they have in common is that they spend a lot of time talking about the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm, those German fairy tales from the 19th century. I am really a lot less interested in talking about those. I'm really interested in thinking about fairy tales in contemporary culture, in the popular culture we're creating today. And so these two collections of stories continue to help me make that transition, right? These two talk about, this one is contemporary fiction and the fairy tale, and this one talks about fairy tales transformed. So I'm going to put these two over here on this side. And another source I have that kind of goes with those is this one, Linda Hutcheon, A Theory of Adaptation. She's not really talking about fairy tales, but she's talking about kind of adaptation in general. So she's another really important thinker for me and the way that I think. So I'm going to put her over here. So on my right hand and my left hand, I have these two thinkers that really shape the way that I think about things. And then these sources that I have left in front of me, these sources kind of help me to get to some of the places that I want to be talking about fairy tales. So the two sources that I didn't have time to print out, these two represented by my tablet and my phone, these are two sources that are thinking about the representation of disabilities in fairy tales. So how does blindness or deafness or the inability to walk, how do those things show up in fairy tales, and what can we learn from that? So I'm going to put them down here. This source is talking about Disney specifically. So I'm going to put this source over here with these adaptation study guides. Remember, this one was contemporary fiction. So this one's talking about contemporary fiction. This one's mostly talking about contemporary film because that's what Disney makes. So I'm going to put these two together because I think they have cool things to say to each other. Okay. This source is also really important to me. This source is The Dark Fantastic by Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, and she is writing some new theory about the way that race is represented in fantastic fiction generally, not just fairy tales, but fantastic fiction is a larger category that can include fairy tales. And Thomas is thinking specifically about the ways that blackness get represented in fantastic worlds, right? So fantastic worlds that don't necessarily resemble our worlds still have issues with race, especially when those worlds are written by white authors. So most of what she is looking at in here is representations of black and brown characters in fantastic work written by white authors. So I'm going to put her over here. And because she was talking about fantastic fiction in things by white authors, then I went looking for something to put in conversation with Thomas, but about black authors. So I found a couple of things. This is an article by Nnedi Okorafor. She is a Nigerian American fantasy and science fiction writer. And this is not a piece of fiction from her, but this is a piece where she talks about the kind of fantastic work that she does. So I'm going to put her over here. Kind of these two are having a conversation together. And this author is also talking about a similar thing. So this is a scholar who is talking about that issue of blackness and the fantastic. So I'm going to put these three together. So if they were all coming to my tea party, Ebony Elizabeth Thomas and Nnedi Okorafor and Kiana Whitted, they would have an interesting conversation, I think. So I'm going to put their sources together, and I'm going to also put them near Prop up here at the top of the tea party, because I think that they might have an interesting conversation with him about structure. The last source that I have in front of me goes back to thinking about old European fairy tales, but this one really helps me to connect from the old stuff to the new stuff. So I'm gonna, I've said that before, talking about making connections. I said that when I was talking about this source. So I'm gonna put these two sources together down here in that part of the tea party. So let me tip the camera down just a little bit. So what you can see now is, instead of having my sources in those two big stacks next to each other, I have them laid out in a way that is logical to me in this moment, based on what these sources have to say about my topic. So I've grouped them by sources who might have an interesting conversation with each other. So how do I get from here to paragraphs in a lit review? Well, let me tip the camera back up so I don't have to lean over. There we go. So the next step for me as a writer of a lit review is to start by imagining what these conversations would be. So, for example, these people who are having the conversation about blackness and the fantastic, they might talk about the ways that the fantastic is an opportunity to imagine a different world, but too often that imagining has been done by white authors and white publishers, right? So there has been a limit on the imagination. And what is only just starting to happen with authors like Nnedi Okorafor in the current generation is that we are starting to see in mainstream publishing in the United States, we're starting to see what the Black imagination might look like in fantastic spaces. So that's a conversation that these three would have together. So now I can sit down in front of my computer and I can write a paragraph about that draws on all three of these authors, right? Ebony Elizabeth Thomas kind of highlights the problem of race in fantastic literature, and Nnedi Okorafor and Kiana Whitted, they kind of come and talk about one possible solution, one possible answer. And then my two authors, Leduc and Schmeissing, who are thinking about disability in the fantastic and in fairy tales specifically, right? I might have a next paragraph about them, and they're going to say, you know, disability shows up in a similar way, right? Too often the imagination has been dominated by abled people, and so disability shows up as a punishment, or disability shows up as something to be escaped or cured. When in reality, people who themselves have disabilities, they would imagine the possibilities differently than an abled author and an abled publisher. And so these voices are also not heard enough in contemporary fairy tale literature and film. So that's just a brief overview of thinking about how to write a review of the literature. So what you need to remember is that it is your tea party, and you are the queen. And the queen gets to decide who comes to the party, what they get to talk about, and with whom they have a conversation. And you can take your sources and spread them out like this if you have them physically. If all your sources are digital, you can just use some Post-it notes to create a tea party like this, and then you can think about how your sources would talk to each other and write that up into your lit review.